Just want to introduce Lucy, who will be chairing the next panel, which is on climate change. So over to you, Lucy.
Over to John to see if everyone's here. And I think they are. We have 4 panelists.
Yes, everybody's present. Yeah, excellent. There we are, Natalie. Hello there. Hi, welcome.
And we have Khadj, and we have and Annie, I hope. Lovely to see you. So, sorry, I'm getting a slight echo here again. So, great. So what we're going to do, we're going to have a brief discussion about climate change, and the way we're going to do this is that I'm going to be delighted to introduce a short presentation by Annie and Gareth, and we're then going to have a bit of a panel discussion, but I'm also going to ask Natalie to make a few comments on the presentation after we've had it. We're delighted particularly that Natalie is able to step in at very short notice after Carla Denny was unable to attend today. So fabulous to have you all here. And I'm going to briefly read the bios and then we'll get on with the slides. So our 2 slide presenters, first of all, Annie Michell. Hi, Annie. Annie is a grandmother, psychologist, playback theatre performer and psychotherapist who grew up in a mining community in County Durham. She tries to make connections between community and clinical psychology, climate and the environment, health and our various troubles and joys of birth, death and life. And Gareth Morgan, who has done a major work on the slides along with his fellow psychologists. Gareth is a clinical psychologist and lecturer on the Leicester Clinical Psychology Training Programme, having previously worked in learning disability and adult mental health services. He's the co-chair for the Association of Clinical Psychologists Climate Action Network. Welcome, Gareth. Khadj Rouf is going to join us for the panel discussion. Khadj is a consultant clinical psychologist with professional and personal interests in safeguarding trauma-informed care and the impact of trauma on mental health. We're going to hear one of her poems very shortly. And last but certainly not least, Natalie Bennett, or for formal occasions, apparently we should address you as Baroness Bennett of Manor Castle. Became the 2nd Green Party member of the House of Lords in 2019, since when she has worked often on health issues, including the Medicines and Medical Devices Act, the Health and Social Care Act, as well as the Environment Act. And she's now deep in the Energy Bill, which started in the House of Lords. She spent most of her career as a journalist, finishing as editor of The Guardian Weekly after 4 years in Bangkok, including a volunteer with the Thai National Commission on Women's Affairs, reflecting her first politics as a feminist. So fab to have you all here. And then if technology serves us, I believe we're going to do a presentation.
Absolutely, we are. And before I share my screen, I'm going to stick a link in the chat to a Slido, because we want to, as we'll explain on the first screen, we want to kind of get the temperature of how people feel when the topic of climate change comes up. Yeah, technology works. I will get the correct screen up. Okay, can you see my slides?
Yes, they're not full screen yet, but you can see them. Yes, great. Fab.
Pass over to you.
Thanks everybody for joining us. Gaz and I are clinical psychologists who've been concerned for years about the links between our environment, what happens to us, and how we feel, think and act. And Lucy, thanks for posing the question, is the climate crisis driving us crazy? Or as the subtitle of a book we'll be putting a link into here, Active Hope by Joanna Macy and Chris Johnstone, how can we face the mess we're in without going crazy? Or, and linking in with Gabriel's presentation just now, can we together be part of a mass movement demanding change so that we can all thrive within planetary limits? So as we begin, please go to that Slido that Gareth has put up for us. We're really aware that thinking about climate change and environmental harm is a very emotive topic. And we're keen to see how you're joining us today and to acknowledge the very many different ways that we all respond. In overview of today, we're going to be exploring how all of us have good reason to be distressed and are distressed, many of us, about the climate, but that we have problems with terms such as eco-anxiety and other mental health framings. We're not going to be lecturing you on the science, but we do need to acknowledge the urgency of the situation, the mess we're in, and in doing so, recognising that climate harm intersects with other social justice issues and struggles. Finally, we'll invite us all to consider ways we can empower one another to take meaningful action and to care for one another.
Thank you, Annie. So I'm going to now try and stop sharing the slides, and if I can share the results of the Slido to see the responses we're getting. So can people see this word cloud coming up? So we've got a lot of feelings that I know I can certainly empathise with, Annie. A lot of people feeling angry, presumably because governments, world leaders haven't taken control. A lot of people feeling hopeless, which I know I can empathise with at times.
And it can feel overwhelming. Therefore, really good to be together thinking about this and not on our own.
Yeah, scared, worried, powerless, afraid. Some people feeling interested. So a whole range of emotions which are completely understandable, and
which we would share as well, Gaz. It's something we've talked about between us, how we experience this as parents and grandparents, thinking about our future generations.
Absolutely, definitely. Yes, a real difficult topic to engage with emotionally. So we need to think about safety during today's talk as well. So in thinking about safety, obviously all emotional responses are completely understandable. Whatever you're feeling is completely understandable. There's no correct way to feel about this. Some of the stuff that we're talking about might be familiar to people, but some of it might be new and it's potentially overwhelming. So remember, obviously, that you can log off and you don't have to stay here for this presentation. Do what you need to do to keep yourself safe. The Climate Psychology Alliance website, if you just Google Climate Psychology Alliance, you'll come to a website which, through the Climate Psychology Alliance, they offer 3 free sessions for people experiencing distress, and also climate cafes, which are spaces where people can go just to speak about their own emotional reactions to the climate crisis. We've also posted links for resources for people struggling with distress in relation to the climate crisis, and we'll share a link with the slides and all of these resources at the end. So as Annie said, we don't want to spend long speaking about the science of the climate crisis and what the situation is. That's not our main focus. But given we are talking about climate-related distress and people being anxious about the climate crisis, it's important to acknowledge that the people have good reason to be worried. This is an urgent situation. So climate scientists have been warning us for decades that this is an urgent issue. Various countries have signed up to the 2016 Paris Agreement with the aim of keeping temperature rises to ideally below 1.5 degrees C, above the pre-industrial mean, but with the aim of keeping them definitely below 2 degrees C, above the pre-industrial mean. And when we kind of get above these temperatures, there's a real danger of hitting tipping points, which involve breakdowns in various ecological systems that accelerate the harms of the climate crisis, accelerate temperature rise, accelerate flooding. And there's a danger that we start experiencing levels of heating and flooding that are going to displace millions and result in various famines, droughts, etc. So the graphs at the bottom of the screen show, the blue line show temperature rise from the year 0 to present. The red line shows CO2 emissions, and we can see them. The recent decades, both the temperature and the CO2 levels have risen in a very similar rate and very rapidly, much more rapidly than over the rest of history. We're currently at 1.2 degrees C above the pre-industrial mean. And the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, have produced various reports warning us that we need to take this really seriously. But this year, kind of effectively published what's been kind of labelled our last warning, really, that emissions really need to peak by 2025 if we are to have a chance of keeping the Paris Agreement goals within reach. And indeed, we're currently on pace for between 3 to 5 degrees C warming by the end of the century, so double the Paris Agreement. Given the last ice age was 4 degrees C below the pre-industrial mean, it becomes very hard to think about how our civilization can carry on, and certainly how we can have a planet that's going to be habitable for as many people as there currently are on the planet. But the climate crisis doesn't impact upon us all equally. I know we've got an international audience here today, but my understanding is that most people are from the UK. And whilst in the UK, we've been experiencing a lot of the effects of the climate crisis this summer. In Europe, we've had our hottest summer, most wildfires. We've had impacts on crops within Britain. Other countries, generally often the countries that are least responsible for emissions, have been enduring the most severe effects. So this summer, we've seen 50 million people displaced by floods in Pakistan alone. The Horn of Africa have been enduring severe famine and droughts. And the IPCC warned us that by 2030, an estimated 700 million people will be displaced in Africa alone due to the impacts of climate-related effects. And it's not only the sort of poorer, most disadvantaged nations that are going that are struggling the most and will struggle the most, but within any nation, the poorest, those with least access to resources, will find it hardest to adapt. There's been various research, various studies that have linked the sort of acute impacts of climate crisis, such as flooding, wildfires, famine, displacement, to distress. This shouldn't surprise us. Bad things happen. We're going to get distressed. But unfortunately, a lot of this research draws on terms such as that these types of impacts increase the rates of mental disorder. Obviously, it shouldn't come as much of a surprise to people attending this festival that we have a problem with framing these responses in this way. And we'll speak more about some of these problems when we think about the responses to climate anxiety in a couple of slides' time.
Psychiatrists, psychologists, peer support workers, one another, everybody to whom we turn to for help when we're distressed, are increasingly finding that environmental concerns are at least part of people's direct experience of emotional distress, psychological distress. This important research that by Caroline Hickman and others that we're highlighted here just demonstrates that across 10 countries from the global north and the global south, how very significantly children themselves are feeling the distress. We know it's not just children, we know it's us too, as that word cloud showed us earlier on. But what we're really concerned about here is that sense of betrayal, fear, anger, and betrayal that we're experiencing, children and us adults. We're part of the world, we're attached to the world, and our distress can be seen as our response to that attachment being disrupted. It's really hard to feel secure in our place in the world. And as humans together, we have responsibilities to safeguard our environment for future generations, for all of us.
So we're seeing a proliferation of terms: climate anxiety, ecological grief, eco-distress. These terms are much more around in our discourse at the moment. And these labels aren't formal mental health diagnoses and diagnostic categories yet. Thankfully, they're not, but we're seeing some professionals call for diagnostic criteria for these labels. it's important to acknowledge that you know, we do recognise some people find these terms useful. Some people find that the labels are now allow them to connect with other people who are also concerned and perhaps feeling quite alienated because others around them aren't taking their concerns seriously. So saying you're experiencing climate anxiety can support people to link up. And hopefully the majority of people that use these labels recognise that they're not the problem. It's not them that's the problem for feeling distress, but the problem relates to the fact that world leaders have failed to take action in relation to the climate crisis. However, the growing use of these terms risks individualizing, medicalizing, and alienating people. The labels risk locating the problem within the individual, that they're being too sensitive, or they're thinking irrationally about the situation. And the solution could therefore be viewed as we need to medicate, drug these people to numb their emotions, or provide one-to-one talking therapy to address faulty thinking styles, none of which address the root causes, none of which address the feelings of alienation and betrayal that many people are feeling. At the same time, these terms, the fact that we speak about climate anxiety and our concerns about, you know, raising levels of climate anxiety in young people, positions not being concerned about the climate ecological emergencies as the healthy norm. The norm is to not be worried about these things. And we see this playing out in calls by some politicians to stop speaking to children about the climate crisis because we don't want to distress them. And all this adds to our societal failure to speak openly about the climate crisis and to acknowledge it. And this in turn further alienates people who are able to stay connected to the climate crisis. And indeed, we'd agree with many other professionals and writers who've gone before us, such as Caroline Hickman and Britt Ray, that we need to reframe eco-anxiety, climate anxiety as reflecting eco-empathy, an ability to stay connected to the threats our planet is facing. And indeed, there's evidence that being anxious about the climate is associated with pro-environmental behaviour, and also with hope, which might seem a bit paradoxical, but it makes sense when we think that if anxiety is associated with action, then we need action in order for there to be hope. And it also makes sense when we recognise that perhaps a lot of people cope with these existential threats by thinking, well, there's nothing that can be done about it, so I'm just going to carry on as normal.
So we are all together in this, in the different parts of the world, wherever we are in our life and our life cycle, in our place in the world. And just as existential threats affect us when we face a terminal illness or life-threatening illness, it can feel as if we're somehow entering a different world of meaning, while at the same time realising that our joys and values of life come through our appreciation of the small acts of kindness and connection and wonder that can make the unbearable bearable. This is a shared trauma, one which it does affect us all, and our responses depend upon our context, our circumstances, and our immediate priorities. And now Gaz is going to go on to talk about that way in which our different positions affect us in terms of how we respond to that threat.
Yeah, absolutely. I won't spend long on this slide just because of time, and also because it's a very wordy slide with no intention of reading it out. But this slide is an abridged version of a table from a paper that Annie, Lucy, and I wrote along with Garrett Barnwell and Kirsten Schuckler, using the Power Threat Meaning Framework, which I suspect some people here will have heard of, to try and make sense of different reactions to the climate crisis. And our main reason for wanting to share this is, if we think about the climate crisis as a cultural trauma, shared trauma impacting us upon us all, then we think there's more helpful ways than thinking about people who are in denial and people who are climate anxious, but rather to recognize that we're all responding with different threat responses in relation to this situation, threat responses which we'll use for different reasons at different times. And as therapists, rather than kind of labeling people as climate anxious or problematizing things, we'd encourage people to to help people to think about what threat responses are helpful for them at different times, and what's unhelpful, and what's helpful for the planet at different times. And as Gabor was speaking about the importance of helping people to develop their own meanings, their own narratives about what's going on for them.
And this is a moment for us to stop and pause, developing our own meanings, thinking about creativity as we connect with this, and how poetry is one way in which we can pause, think, and connect with ideas. This poem is by Khadj. Thanks, Khadj, for letting us hear the recording of it here. Here we go.
Dots. These giants of men, this privileged few who talk and talk, have brought us to the brink, who seem impatient for change but remain in stasis, tapping their mobiles, fingering their wallets, buying up land as though they hold dominion. What hubris is this? Time is money, must go faster, for blessed be the profit margin and the means of production, as long as it is cheap, underpaid or free. Splendid, spiffing, capital, consumption, but underneath the glitter of all this, we are sick. Silently things have disconnected. Man, paragon, casting bad seeds on the earth, making the soil bear what it cannot bear. The lines between dusk and dawn have blurred. We lose the sense of consequence, know the days but lose the seasons. Like lotus eaters, insensate, drifting as the constellations of scorch, of dust, of flood, of poisoned air tap their warnings, only to be heard by the trees, the bees, the seas, the whales who choke their mournful song. The end is coming, we don't have long. Now we are sick with consumption, coughing as our leafy lungs collapse, thirsty as the stony riverbeds crack, drowning as the Arctic weeps. Time is running, we must not sleep. The world is burning for us to hear the code that's tapping everywhere, to join the dots in our imaginations. The composition of stars, the quintessence of all things, is guttering in the filth, and we will all fall down. These giants of men, this privileged few, bluster and fester whilst reality now loudly knocks. Time is running. Join the dots.
Thank you, Khadj, for that poem.
Thank you so much, Khadj. And I saw somebody put in the chat that they're crying as they hear that. Every time I've heard you read that, I felt so moved, and it's so powerful. And yeah, the composition of stars. It's very powerful to engage in that way. So yeah, thanks, Khadj.
And then the privileged few, the men makes me feel angry as well, as we speak about protest shortly.
And it's really helpful to have that poem to connect with, leading into this next slide, where we're recognising that climate harm is a complex, wicked problem. It's caused by business as usual, our extractive, colonising ways, and change is needed at all and every level. Personal, social, political, and that does include, we believe, shaking up our dominant understandings of health and mental health. The rich and powerful have to be confronted, and thinking about understanding about our mental health, psychological well-being, as the Association of Clinical Psychologists put it here, the ultimate answers are not lying in new mental health treatments or expansion of existing services, but in our collective responses to collective distress because of this emergency and because of the wider intersecting elements of the mess we're in. Thanks.
So another way we can support people who are distressed about climate crisis, one of the things that people report finding most distressing is that sense of alienation, the sense of powerful others, be that professionals, politicians, parents who are powerful in relation to children, not taking action. So one of the ways we can help with those feelings is by actually taking a stance, becoming involved in activism, visibly supporting movements. One of the things that gives Annie and I a bit of hope is the 3.5% rule, which Erica Chenoweth, who's a political scientist in Harvard, has looked back on various non-violent, look back in various times of great political change, and found that when 3.5% of the population got behind a non-violent direct action movement, it's never failed to bring about radical, urgent change. It's meant to be twice as effective as armed conflict. Not that we'd ever encourage anyone to take up weapons, but it's powerful. And although movements such as Extinction Rebellion are nowhere near the 3.5% mark yet, there is evidence that we're reaching sort of social tipping points. More and more people are becoming concerned about the climate crisis, and more people are taking action. We're very aware that Extinction Rebellion are very divisive. A lot of people, the press they get in the media is very negative, and a lot of people don't agree with their tactics. It's also important to recognize that the tactics they're using aren't new. These are the same tactics that were used by the suffragettes, American Civil Rights Movement, the Green Belt movement in Kenya, various other movements. And when there's power, there's resistance. And so when people are taking a stand, then Murdoch media, etc., is going to kick back and try and frame people's actions negatively.
It's very striking that in the latest IPCC report, strong evidence was reported that social movements underpin system change, as we've been talking here. So yes, as Gareth said, there's reason for hope in coming together.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's lots of other actions we can do as well as individuals. We can't cover them all here, but given this is about climate anxiety, I thought I'd focus this last slide on this. So if we want to support people in relation to distress about climate breakdown, one of the things we need to do is break this taboo about not speaking about how we're feeling about the climate crisis. And one of the most radical actions we can do is to start having conversations about it, create space to speak with others about the climate and ecological emergencies, listen to other people's concerns and validate them. We need to be able to care for ourselves and each other. If we recognise this is a shared trauma we're all going through, an unprecedented cultural trauma, and it's important that we can listen and not pathologise each other's reactions. We can listen, validate, be with, self-compassion for ourselves, for not, Annie and I are not on this all the time. We're not constantly stressed about it. None of us can be carbon neutral. We need to be compassionate for ourselves and for others, reflect on our strengths and values. We all have parts we can play on this. Think about the benefits and problems of our different responses. We can support connection for people that both reduces isolation and inspires change. We have much more power when we're in a collective and taking collective action. So we'll finish the presentation there. We've got a list of resources here and some slides. So we'll post a link for the slides and the resources in the chat. And I'll stop my screen now. Were you on mute, Lucy?
Yes, thank you very much, Annie and Gareth, for guiding us through this really, really challenging topic in a way that I think enables us to think about it, feel about it without feeling overwhelmed, and hopefully without ending up being labelled with climate anxiety disorder. And I'd like to ask Natalie, who's joined us today, any immediate thoughts you have about the presentations you've heard, which I'm sure contains a lot of information you're already very familiar with, but any thoughts you have, we'd be very interested to hear.
Well, first of all, thank you very much to Gareth, Annie and Khadj for such a powerful and comprehensive presentation. And I think in a way it's sort of, I found it very affirming because it reflects lots of the things that I say on a daily basis. And I go back to early 2013, and I'd only been Green Party leader for a few months. And I started what have since been many hundreds of different public meetings. And I was starting to learn that you get encountered by people coming up to you afterwards and asking you questions about anything you can imagine. And a father came up to me in this early 2013, and this was before there was much discussion about concern about the climate emergency. But he came up to me and said, I'm really concerned, my 8-year-old, should I actually try and protect them from knowing about the climate emergency, or should I be honest with them? And my first reaction was, well, I'm not a parent, I'm not a psychologist, I really don't know that I can provide a response to this. But he was obviously very anxious and very uncertain. And so my response to him then was, well, first of all, I don't believe, based on my own experience as a human being, that you can actually conceal anything from children. Children will always find out about what's happening in their own society, environment, household, etc. And concealing things just makes people anxious. But more, I said that what I thought would be the best thing for that 8-year-old would be to know that there is this big problem and adults aren't doing a good enough job on it, but that she can get together with her friends, her workmates, her people in her neighbourhood, and do something to take it on, to take some kind of action. That was me just reacting in the moment. But I did talk to a psychologist afterwards, and I was told that was a pretty good response, and it's one I've been giving ever since. And one of the things that I find when I do so many public meetings of different groups, is people do come in feeling desperately scared. And what I'm aiming to do, and what I honestly believe, is people can leave those meetings, and people tell me they do leave those meetings, with a feeling of hope. And hope is the absolute crucial emotion. And where my message of hope starts from is that, and it's perhaps, it starts perhaps counterintuitively, because we're talking today about the climate emergency, but that's just one of the crises that we're facing. You look at the planetary limits, and I'd recommend Kate Raworth is a really good person to follow to find out about more of this. Climate is just one of the planetary limits. We're hitting planetary limits I'm doing a great deal of work at the moment on what are so-called novel substances, things like pesticides, dangerous chemicals released into the environment. We've exceeded that planetary limit. The nitrogen and phosphate cycles, there's others and others. But the good news is, where we are now is profoundly unstable. Things are not going to stay the same as they are. And I can say that to you as a person who's in one way or another been involved in politics virtually my whole life. We're in a very unstable time of massive potential change. And that's good news, because just look at where we are now. And history is not pre-written. History is made by people's actions. Sometimes people say to me, how do you know you're all going to win out and it'll all be fine in the end? And the answer is that I don't know that it will be, but I know that it's possible that it will be, and that people getting together and taking action collectively. And I think I've been really impressed. I've managed to listen to a fair bit of today, and Indigo was talking earlier today about the need of people working together. And I think someone earlier and Indigo too, was talking about the need for self-care. And as activists or advocates, it's really crucial that people do look after each other. And what you just said, Gareth, about not beating ourselves up about individual behaviour, I'm concerned about system change, not individual behaviour. And what we need to do is make the most environmentally and socially responsible thing to do the easiest, cheapest and simplest thing, so everyone can do it. So, I once had a young woman from Brixton who came along to a Green Party meeting and said, well, I'm a Green and I'm getting sort of harassed all the time by my neighbours who say, after they've come from their third 0 hours contract job that day, and they've got on the bus to go to the supermarket with a couple of kids, and they've forgotten their bag for life, and now they've got to pay 5p for a plastic bag. They think that's my fault. And I can understand, the answer is to change the system so that their life is much less stressed and much less harassed, and they've got more money and better transport and everything else. So all of those things are about the system change. So, I think it's really great that you're doing this today. I think it's kind of important that we really focus on that system. One of the slides was talking about business as usual, and there is a real risk. And indeed, I was just listening to this really good London Review of Books podcast talking about growth versus degrowth people. And green growth is sort of the dominant narrative at the moment. But we know as Greens you can't have infinite growth on a finite planet. And continuing the system as we have now is terribly bad for public health, for people, as well as for planet. And, just doing as we do now with solar panels and electric cars and all of that, that is no kind of answer. And just as the kind of social innovation that's gaining a great deal of traction, and again, to finish on a positive note, things like a 4-day working week as standard with no loss of pay. Eventually, New Economics Foundation's gone down to talking about going down to a 3-day working week as standard in the longer term. Now, that you think about what that would do to people's quality of life. They might have less stuff in it, but what better quality of life that would deliver, and a universal basic income so that nobody needs to fear not being able to put food on the table, keep a roof over their head. All of these things are actions for climate, for actions for all of our other environmental crises, all of our other social crises, and they make a better world. So now is a moment of huge possibility, and people getting together like you are today. You know, my message I try and drive home to everyone is we need a society where everyone makes politics what they do, not have done to them. And that democracy, if you ask me to come and talk about algae, I'll get democracy in there somewhere, because it's actually, people will choose the 4-day working week, the universal basic income, when they're given those options, they're presented to them. And those are the kind of options, you know, clean air, air pollution. The actions we need against climate are also the actions we need against air pollution for physical and increasingly we know mental health. All of these things fit together. We're talking about building a better society. So, you know, it's really great everything that I've heard today. And just one final thing to comment, I was terribly impressed by Margot's presentation on trauma-informed schools. And I've done a little bit of work in Parliament on schools and prisons being trauma-informed in particular. But I really want to say that something I'd like to do some more work on, and I'll certainly be looking into it. But thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Natalie, and thank you for listening throughout the day. You've got a busy life, and I wasn't necessarily assuming you'd be able to be with here for more than just this presentation. So thanks ever so much for picking up those themes. I wonder if anyone else wants to pick up on anything Natalie just said. Khadj, do you want to say anything? Anything particularly strike you that resonated with you?
There's so much to say, isn't there? I hope you can I hope you can hear me okay, and thank you for sharing my poem and doing it in the way you did, because I've got some unstable internet here, so I'm very grateful. And I'm just going to help people with the pronunciation of my name as well, which is either Khadija or Khadj. I am from the north, and I'm also via Bangladesh, so I've just helped people with the name. Thank you for the response to my poem, and I suppose one of the things that I wanted to have the chance to say was it's a deeply distressing topic, and it's one of the hard positions is to face into it and the reality of it, and to try and stay present and to act. And I think it's really good to hear stories that are positive and hopeful. I am a clinical psychologist. I'm also a survivor of abuse. I see lots of parallels in what's happening with unfettered capitalism and abuse. I think we have to address inequalities within society and talk about a fairer distribution of power and social justice. And I am also a poet, which is one of the things that's helped me in my own kind of personal recovery and journey, is creative acts, and connecting with the possibility of retelling and reimagining one's own story and the story of others. And I think that's incredibly important, because I think power will often dominate the story and make you think that there's only one way. And actually we need to have a plurality of voices out there reimagining what the world can look like. And as I was making lots of frantic notes about all the things I might want to say if I got the chance, I came up with an acronym, which is probably out there already, but I was dead chuffed with myself, which is IDEA, which is we need to engage with our imaginations, determination, ethics, and activism. And I'm going to shut up there.
Thank you, that's fab. We do have a few questions from the attenders. Annie and Gareth, do you want to pick up anything that we've just heard, or shall I try a question out on us?
Can I just say something about being part of a social movement?
Please do.
There was some
please do,
really good
yeah.
work that was presented this week by our social science colleague Aaron Theory, and I have an awful feeling I'm not pronouncing his name right either. But it's about what is the role of social movements in fostering change around tipping points. And he talks about movements being crucial to effect social change, and asking this question, what is a social movement? It feels like we're part of a social movement here today. That what he describes as a social movement is a loose coalition of organisations, a common problem, diversity of tactics, and legacies, cultural legacies, legislative ones, movements learning together, and that organisations can be part of multiple movements so that this is intersectional. But it feels so lovely to be here, and the responses in the chat have been so enabling and engaged. But it so much feels we're stronger together. We're different. We've got different emphases, but together we're stronger in making our world more empathic, more kind, more livable.
Definitely, thank you. We have a question that specifically picked up on the kind of diagnostic angle of this, which I might pose to the panel. And in posing this, I'm remembering that the three of us, Annie, Gareth and I, and a couple of others were involved in advising to a recent major report, weren't we, on the mental health impact of climate change. I won't actually name it, but one of the sections that particularly riled me, I have to say, and all of us, was, do you remember this one? It was about how Indian farmers who'd lost their livelihoods due to climate change were coincidentally and unfortunately suffering from a mass outbreak of PTSD, which urgently needed treating. I may be slightly stereotyping it, but it's the kind of thing that I think we really don't want to see. And given all we've heard today about the way neoliberalism and capitalism can, you know, find various ways of disconnecting us from what needs to happen in society and essentially pathologizing individuals, I think we do have to be aware of this risk. So somebody's asked, is there a real risk that climate anxiety disorder will end up in the next DSM? That would be DSM 6. What do we think? Are we placing our bets, folks? Anybody going to talk about that?
You go, Khadj. I go after. Yeah.
I very much hope not. And, you know, these are understandable distress reactions, aren't they? And it depends what you then do about that distress. And if we're looking to kind of very limited and individualized ways of helping people, then we're ignoring the elephant in the room, which is about the system's impacts and the system role in play that's being played in this. And my understanding of systems like DSM are that disorders shouldn't be something which is expected or culturally sanctioned or expected in response to particular events like bereavement.
No, except bereavement reaction disorder, of course, is in there, but it shouldn't be. Did you want to say something, Gareth, about?
Yeah, well, I
that may be upon us. Yeah.
I guess I'm just thinking about that idea about we're at a point of social change, and maybe we're at a point of social change with diagnosis as well. I mean, it's getting to the point I don't really care what's in DSM-6. You know, if it's in DSM-6 or if it's not. I mean, obviously it shouldn't be regarded as a disorder, and it shouldn't be in there. But neither should any of the other labels be in there.
Well, obviously.
So yeah. So it's. I think there is a risk. I hope it isn't. But. I remember before DSM-5, there was a lot of backlash about, I can't remember the label, but it was to do with gender identity, and gender identity shouldn't be included in DSM-5, and there was a big outrage in relation to this, and obviously it shouldn't. But it's kind of if this is seen as not pathological, are we validating all the other pathological? Are we saying all these other reactions are pathological? So if it's in there, that gives us more to push against. So hopefully it isn't, but we can resist more if it is there.
I'm kind of intrigued, Natalie, to know whether this is a subject of discussion in the Green Party as to the apologising of individual and understandable responses to distress. I don't know if those kind of conversations happen in the Green Party, and if not, we'd be happy to introduce them in any way in which we were able to. So, is that something?
Well, I must admit, I think we don't have a lot of discussion because we essentially all agree, and we agree with the position. We tend to discuss the things that we disagree on in the nature of most political parties. I think you would find pretty well 100% agreement in the Green Party among the members and councillors and parliamentary representatives that eco-anxiety, so labelled, is a perfectly normal reaction to the state of things. And just speaking personally, I'm always hesitant about politicians telling personal anecdotes, but when we were talking about this today, I kind of feel like I have to, because actually when I was 23, so nearly 30 years ago now, I was in a car crash in which my mother was killed. And just instinctively, and I was lucky that I'd actually, as a journalist, covered some coverage about grief and dealing with grief before that happened to me, because as a 23-year-old Australian, otherwise the only cultural resource I had would have been stiff upper lip. But I chose then, I had symptoms you would have described as post-traumatic stress disorder, which I think would be, it was a very traumatic experience. Obviously, it was a very, very nasty crash. And I had panic attacks. I had attacks of utterly unreasonable rage. I found it hard to go to sleep, etc. But I consciously then decided to treat this as if I'd been punched in the stomach, I would expect to have symptoms. And I had suffered, a massive personal trauma, and my body reacting to that, my mind reacting to that, both of those together reacting to that, I regarded as normal. And we are in a situation now when I see similar healthy responses from climate strikers on the climate. Certainly before COVID, I was most Thursdays in the month. So once Thursday in the month, I'd be out with young climate strikers. Everything from 10 to 18-year-olds. And a lot of them were essentially adopting the same tactic. They were saying, yes, I'm stressed, I'm anxious, and I, feel really bad about the state of the world, and I'm angry about the state of the world, but I'm doing something. I'm here at the climate strike, whether I'm a 10-year-old or a 15-year-old or an 18-year-old, getting the experience of acting and feeling empowered and being with my friends, being with my colleagues, being with other young people I've never met before. All of us together, and I know that makes me feel better. And so, that's what I'm seeing: remarkable wisdom from some very young people.
Yeah.
Thank you for telling us that. And I noticed you used the phrase "unreasonable rage" about your reaction, and I think what we're all saying was that it was reasonable. Your personal situation, your rage was reasonable. Our general planetary situation, our rage is reasonable. Yeah, thank you for that.
Reasonable and vital, that rage. These things are so important to connect with and share. And the other phrase you used, Natalie, in that's really so lovely to hear your personal story, how it connects us all. The phrase you used was cultural resources, and I think that's been a theme here today, hasn't it? And links with another part of this world that we've not touched on so much, but is recognising the importance of Indigenous knowledge as in different societies as sources of wisdom, deep historic wisdom about our connection to the earth, and ways of mutually supporting one another. And another reason I hope that climate distress does not reach diagnostic labelling is that part of that way of construing it means that we export our Western framings, individualized framings of distress, onto a world where actually we could turn it round and do a lot better to learn from how people live in harmony with the earth and be humble in the West about what we could learn together from it.
We've lost so many wisdoms, and hence we're in this mess. And I'm keeping a little bit of an eye on the time, and we could always use more time, couldn't we? But I wonder if we could end up with everybody briefly saying, on behalf of yourself personally, or maybe your friends or family or kids or whatever, what enables you to stay connected with the climate crisis without being overwhelmed? What gives you hope? And I personally feel like this discussion just now has given me hope. So, but as we could quickly go around and hear from each of you, what gives you hope without disconnecting from the very real threats? What enables you to keep going, gives you hope? Would you want to start?
I can go first. I think following on from what Natalie was saying about kind of being out there with the climate protesters, I think for me it's about being around other people that acknowledge it. It is important. We don't have to be speaking about it all the time, but just being with other people who recognise and don't pretend that it's not there, and taking action. And for me, it's the taking action rather than thinking about the end goal, rather than thinking about will this be successful or not, just being able to live in accordance with values and take action and be with other people taking action is what I find most helpful. I'm grateful for these conversations.
What gives me hope is that sense of being in it together and of sharing the load. Both Gareth and I are part of Extinction Rebellion psychologists, and our event at the weekend was cancelled, but some of us still went up to London and met up with one another, had a climate cafe, walked and talked, and that feeling that we can't all do everything, and that we can trust one another, that when I need to step back, someone else will step forward, and that it's that really lovely feeling of shared, of teamwork, of being together that gives me hope.
Thank you. Khadj, what would you say?
I'd say a very similar thing, actually, that staying connected with people is incredibly important, and can be very energizing. So yeah, I think for me, and for obviously creativity is a big thing as well.
Poetry and other forms of creativity, yeah. And Natalie, what keeps you going?
Well, I mean, I would say that elements of what everyone said already is being with other people, like-minded people. Although, as you can imagine, when I'm in the House of Lords, as I am in my office now, that's not an option available to me for a lot of the time, practically speaking. But to add something different to the mix, it's important to allow yourself to actually get away and not live this 24/7. And my personal way I get away is if the Green Party hadn't overtaken my life in around about 2007, I'd started writing a book on the history of the women of London. And so women's history is one of my things that's my getaway moments. Although I also acknowledge and don't beat myself up about the fact that when doing women's history, I somehow or other end up always coming back to the cycle of it ends up relating to, look at all what these amazing women did in the past, so this is what we can do in politics today. So to allow yourself, I think, some time out is really crucial. And just picking up on the point, I think, Lucy, you made about Indigenous people and humility about our current models of Western science. Some of that history reading, I can recommend a great book called The First Astronomers, which is actually showing how a very, very hard science is actually now pointing its telescopes in directions suggested by Indigenous knowledge, one of which examples of they can trace back to an astronomical event 6,200 years ago. So seeing so many different ways of looking at the world and understanding, we have a real problem with the world having narrowed down. Milan Kundera many years ago wrote, "One world means no escape for anyone anywhere." And so just opening up other possibilities with art, different cultures, experiencing different cultures. So allowing yourself to escape sometime. Sorry, that got a bit roundabout, but take some time off as well as get together with everybody else.
Thank you so much, everybody. And I suspect, and I hope, if we did a Slido now, it might come up with some different words. I'm in a slightly different position emotionally than we're at the beginning. All bits are real, aren't they? The despair, the threat is real, and also the hope and the social movement is real. And it's been fabulous to have you here today. Thank you so much for the slides and the poem. And thank you so much, particularly Natalie, for making time at very short notice to step in and be with us.
Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you. Thank you
for having us. Thank you very much.
I think we're going to Jo now.
Thank you, John. Thank you, all of you, for that amazing panel discussion. It was so interesting. What really resonated with me was when you were talking about what keeps you going at the end, about connection and solidarity and sharing times and dialogue and with each other, not kind of being alone in it. It kind of just reminds me of what allies say in this discussion as well, and so how that kind of overlaps. And I guess we're talking, a lot about the same kind of issues in some ways. And what really was powerful was the focus on activism, on doing something, on getting involved. So I really enjoyed that. That slot today. So thank you. And thank you particularly to Natalie, because I know it was really short notice for you. I'm really grateful. I've followed you on Twitter for a while and I was delighted when you said yes. So thank you. But thank you to everyone and to Lucy as well for chairing.